Hopefully you've had the opportunity to watch the video on the reading exercise where there were three voices, and I asked you to see whether you could follow the main narrative of that story, the piece that I was reading. How did you feel during that exercise? Were you one of those that had to stop the video because it just became intolerable and unbearable and you couldn't concentrate anymore? When we do this exercise live, we've had feedback that it's just intolerable for some people, and they had to give up. It's interesting to hear what emotions people go through during that exercise. So for some people, they said that they feel really angry and frustrated. How much were you able to hold on to what I was saying? Did you miss bits? Did you give up, or did you get so far and you thought you had it, and then when the third voice came in, you kind of lost it? So it's thinking about how much information you were able to pick up on, how much you missed, what your emotions were, and what the possible behaviours were. So sometimes people just give up, or they will literally put their hand over their ears. The reason we do that exercise, again, is to illustrate that for people who are over-responsive, and it may, in that example, it was auditory, so it was noise, but it may be that it's visual information. So for lots of, there might be lots of visual stimuli in the environment, lots of pictures on the walls, or lots of things that can be quite distracting for those of us who are very sensitive to visual information. But it's just to illustrate really how challenging it can be when you're trying to do a relatively simple activity of listening to a story, when you have lots of sensitivity and lots of demands placed upon you. So we can see the same kind of reactions and behaviours in that exercise that we'll see for children who may need to deal with a very busy classroom environment or home environment as well. So it's when our volume is turned up. So our threshold, if you like, is very, very low, and it doesn't take a lot of sensory information for us not only to meet that threshold, but to be absolutely bombarded. And we're unable to filter out a lot of the sensory information. So if I ask you now how your feet feel in whatever you're wearing on your feet, whether you've got socks on or you've got footwear on, you can probably notice how they feel, what the seams in your socks feel like, or what your slippers feel like on your toes. For the rest of the time, hopefully your brain has gone, do you know what, I don't need to pay attention to that. That's not important. I'm trying to concentrate on this training. So what we try and do, our central nervous system all the time, is filtering out the information we do and we don't need. And for some children with over-responsivity, they are unable to tune out the feeling of that tag on the back of their clothes. It is just too much. They can't concentrate on what the teacher's saying, or they can't hear what you're saying, because that sensory information is shouting louder, if you like. And again, it can happen in any of the sensory systems, and it can fluctuate throughout the day. What we know is that there's a correlation between over-responsivity and anxiety, or general kind of stress levels. So I tend to give the analogy of going into a busy shopping centre, and if I'm feeling relatively calm and I've had a relatively stress-free day, I can cope with the music in the background of the shops when I go in. I may not even notice it, because you know what? I don't need to pay attention to it too much. It's something nice in the background. If I'm a little bit more, there's more going on, and I'm going into what we'll explain later as the orange, not in the green zone, then I won't be able to cope with the boom, boom, boom of the music, and I might avoid going into the shop, or I might become quite anxious. So it can be subconscious, and we don't realise how we're feeling as a result of the sensory information. People who are over-responsive tend to avoid that sensory information. So they may avoid going into the playground because the challenges are too huge, they're too unpredictable. You've got the unpredictability of touch in the playground, people bumping into you. You may perceive that as a punch rather than what it actually is, which is a brush past. So you may constantly be in that hypervigilant state, that constantly over responsivity, where you have a heightened heart rate, where your adrenaline is surging, your stress hormone is elevated, and avoiding places like canteens or busy environments where things can just be too much. What these children may need is to be more in a quiet environment, or have regular opportunities to be in a quieter environment or a less stimulating and sensory filled environment. Just moving on to sensory overload. So this can present very differently in us all, and it can fluctuate between the fight, flight, freeze response. Most of us tend to have a default survival pattern, but that's not to say that if you respond in fight, you don't respond in freeze and flight. So this is when too much, I give the analogy again of being a computer, and it's almost like when we go into shutdown, when we've just, enough is enough and we need to kind of reboot, and it can look very different. So for some it can be really obvious. You can see when the child's become overloaded, and that might be meltdown, when they're so dysregulated they're unable to cope anymore, and it's apparent that that child needs help. And for others it can be a little bit more tricky to work out that they're struggling and they've become overloaded. So it may be in the freeze response, when they're just absolutely unable to respond and unable to engage in an activity. So it's when we're bombarded with all the sensory information. And what some children do is they may try and have their own strategies, subconscious strategies, to kind of get over this sensory overload. And it may be by using one particular sensory system to distract them, to help them stay calmer and stay more focused. So for some children it might be that they need the visual input, so they might engage with something repetitive. They may hum, they may have a visual, they might say something repetitively, because it helps block out all the extra sensory information. So they're desperately trying to hang on. What we hear a lot of is that children are doing their utmost to hang on throughout their school day, where there are inherent sensory demands, and you may not see this overload because the child's done a really good job of holding on, keeping it in, and then they get home and that's when you see that overload. That's when you see that discomfort and that they've been struggling so much. So it can be very apparent, or it can be a little bit more subtle. And as I've described, it can go into any of the survival patterns, and we need those survival patterns. They're functional. It's when they don't match the sensory demand. So we all need fight or flight, but it's not adaptive to be going into those survival patterns when it doesn't help them engage. This may be useful to have a look at. If you put into YouTube The Hand Model of the Brain by Daniel Siegel, it's a really lovely illustration, a simple illustration of how our upper brain, our higher brain, the more sophisticated part of our brains, and our lower brain, if you're thinking back to the triangle that we talked about in the first part, communicate with one another to try and keep ourselves regulated and on track. But also it kind of normalizes human behavior in all of us, where we flip our lid, and that's when we all become dysregulated and stressed. So we're unable to kind of keep ourselves on track. So we might get really angry or have a meltdown or really emotional. And it can be a really lovely way. They've used it in schools, and a lot of parents are using as well, to kind of, one, explain when they've struggled, when they flipped their lid, to normalize it to the child, but also for the child maybe after they've had a meltdown. And there can be a lot of shame that the child feels after a meltdown. So they may feel that they've been naughty, or that they shouldn't have had that. But it's a nice way, kind of that reparation afterwards, to say, I think what happened is we flipped our lid because our lower brain wasn't talking to our higher brain, and vice versa. So have a look at that, and hopefully you'll find that useful. So in summary, this is about sensory modulation. So ability to kind of shift gears into different sensory states. So filter in the information that we need to attend to and filter out those that are not important. And it helps us focus on what we need to do on a day-to-day basis. Just going into the second part now, as a little bit of a break, but have a think to yourselves about, from a sensory perspective, what kinds of things are you doing consciously or subconsciously to try and keep yourself in the green, which we'll explain a little bit more in the second part around the just right. But green is when we're calm and focused and our best versions of ourselves, when we can function. What kind of things are you doing throughout the day to get yourself into that state? So when you're getting into that kind of 3 o'clock slump, when we all tend to go for the caffeine or the chocolates, that natural lull in the day, what kind of things do you do to think, right, well, I've got this to do, I need to get going, I need to kind of wake myself up? Or what kind of things do you do to calm yourselves down? So when you're becoming a little bit kind of dysregulated and you need to calm down to be able to focus, what kind of things do you do, whether that's the end of the day or when you're feeling a little bit stressed? And what kind of things set you on edge? What kind of things make you go, oh, I can't stand that. That really is awful experience. So we've got the picture of Marmite there. Think about what you do, and then also what other members of your family do to keep themselves on track. And it may differ. And is there any conflict in that? Or is there harmony in that? So are you similar to your son? Are you similar to your partner? Or are you poles apart in terms of what kind of things that you like and when in the day you like them? So for some, it might be that you like to get up and have lots of music on. And for others, your partner just can't stand any noise in the day. Have a think about what works and what doesn't work. So we always talk about what happens next. So when your child has had access to those things, what's the result of that? Are they calm and able to focus, or is there something that really triggers them? And then we'll come back and we'll have a discussion about that.